So chapter 25, the discussion is all about money and the money market, and there's two aspects to the money market. There's the demand side and the supply side, and at the moment we're just kind of talking about the supply side, where money comes from and the role of the financial sector in regulating that, or in controlling it at any rate. So we haven't spoken all yet about price level or inflation. We've just really introduced ourselves to money. So the first bit of the discussion was, what is money, how does it work, why do we have it? We saw that the modern money supply is made up of two different components. Basically, there's the cash component, and then there's a deposit component. So I just called them C and D over there. And ultimately, when we're talking about how what a bank's role is and how a bank makes money, it gets a little bit complicated, and that is basically where we were at. So we said there's a process whereby, for example, the central bank, the Reserve Bank, introduces, in other words, exogenously just injects some cash into the system, into the monetary system, into the economy. And we looked at a number of ways in which the bank, the primary way in which the Reserve Bank could do that through, for example, an open market operation. So leads to an increase in the monetary base. That means that the bank ends up holding excess reserves. It lends those excess reserves out. When it lends those excess reserves out, they get deposited back into the banking system. And once they are deposited back into the banking system, they once again become excess reserves, which then starts the entire circle again. We looked at what that process is as a mathematical progression, in other words, as a geometric series. We saw that if, for example, the Reserve Bank increased the amount of cash in the system, there's a cash injection of 100,000, and the bank was able to reloan 60,000 of it, in other words 60% of that 100,000 after that initial loan had been redeposited back into the system. Then of that 60,000, once that was redeposited back into the system, the banking system was able to once again lend another 60% of that 60,000 out. Then it's going to be lending another 36,000 out, which is going to become deposits back into the system. And 60% of that 36,000 will be lent out, and so on and so on. What we're looking at is a geometric sequence which can be summarized as A being the initial change in the monetary base, in other words, that initial cash injection, the value of A, divided by 1 minus, and L here is essentially the proportion of each initial deposit that can be relent. In other words, 60% of any amount loaned out initially gets redeposited, and of that redeposit, 60% of the initial loan amount is once again lent back into the system to create new deposits, etc. So L would be 60%, so 1 minus L would be 40%. So if we take this A divided by 1 minus L relationship, this little relationship here, and we plug in the values from our example, we get 100,000 divided by 1 minus 0.6. In other words, 100,000 times 1 divided by 0.4, which is the same as saying 100,000 times 2.5. In other words, 1 divided by 0.4 is 2.5. So 100,000 times 2.5 equals 250. This 2.5 is what we call the money multiplier, or just MM in this shortened abbreviation that the textbook uses, MM. So essentially, MM, if we assume that there is no currency drain ratio, then the only thing that prevents banks from lending out any deposited amount is the required reserve ratio. in which case our money multiplier is given by 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. If we do have some kind of currency drain ratio, then this equation is a little bit more complicated. If the currency drain ratio was given by, for example, the letter A, then it would be 1 plus A divided by A plus RR equals the money multiplier. So without A, we can just cross those out, and it's 1 over RR equals the money multiplier. So we then wanted to play around with this example, question 16 from, I think it was test 1 of the second semester last year. We were given the following information concerning the banking system. We were told that the reserve ratio is 20%. The reserve ratio is 20%. We're asked, what is the value of excess reserves in the banking system? And if these excess reserves are loaned out, what is the total value of additional loans that could be created? And what is the money multiplier? If our reserve ratio is 20%, it's easy. Money multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve ratio, 1 over 0.2. So 10 over 2 is 5. Money multiplier is 5. If our reserve ratio is 20% and our deposits are 220, then 20% of 220 would be required reserves. Required reserves is 44. If our actual reserves are 72 and our required reserves are 44, that means the excess reserves are 28. If we lend out those excess reserves, 28, right? That is essentially the additional money that can be circulated within the economy, and in other words, create an additional loan. We multiply 28 by our money multiplier, which is 5, to get the total value of additional deposits that would come from these excess reserves. So it's 28 plus 80% of 28 plus 80% of 80% of 28 plus. So it's 28 times 5 gives us 140. So the total additional loans created would be 140. Righty-ho. Any issues or any questions or anything you want to raise at this point? Yeah?
Is there a difference between actual reserve rate and required reserve
rate? It would depend on the context, but the way that you are saying it would imply, for example, that there are some kind of required reserve, there's some required reserve rate, right? In other words, that the central bank sets. It's a legal issue. In other words, that's their regulatory mandate. They say whatever it is you need to keep required reserves some percentage. Now, for example, this in the banking system at the moment, the actual reserves are 72, whereas required reserves are only 44. So if we were to work this out as a rate, 72 over 220, we would get some actual reserve rate, right? In which case it would mean nothing really. In other words, that rate would just be a consequence of these particular numbers. It wouldn't mean anything specific. But sometimes we also refer to a desired reserves rate or ratio, right? In other words, the central bank may say, by law, you need to keep 20% in reserve. That's your required reserves. The banks might themselves like to keep an additional amount on reserve, right? Maybe they like to keep their actual reserve ratio at 25%, for example, right? And that 25% might be made up of required reserves of 20% plus desired reserves of an additional 5%. Okay? In which case, the actual reserve ratio might refer to the combination of the required reserves and the desired reserves, right? So again, it would just depend on the context. If there was some indication that there was also a desired reserve ratio, then your actual reserve ratio might differ from your required reserve ratio as something that banks want to adhere to, as opposed to just, when you've got some excess reserves added to your required reserves, in which case your actual reserve ratio will be different to what the required reserve ratio is, But of course, you can then lend those excess reserves, and the banking system would then sort of gravitate towards whatever the required reserve ratio was. Yes? Yeah.
Is there another formula to work out the required reserve ratio?
When you say another formula, meaning?
Like, is there another way with other variables that we can work out? So, for example, can I ask if this one's correct?
Okay.
Reserves over deposits.
Reserves over deposits. Is that the required reserve ratio? Is that what you're asking? So if you look at your, so the inverse of what you've spoken about, reserves over deposits, or deposits over reserves, right? Deposits over reserves is simply the money multiplier. In other words, the money multiplier is given by the ratio of your deposits to your reserves. Okay. The amount of reserves that would be required, right? In other words, 20% as an example. If the required reserve ratio was 20%, right, then the ratio of reserves to deposits, in other words, R over D, would be 20%, right? That is indeed how you would, that's by definition what the required reserve ratio would need to be in order for the banking system to be adhering to the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio, if it says 20%, means that 20% of your deposits need to be held as reserves, in which case R reserves divided by deposits would be 20%, because that would be the mandated ratio, right? However, is there some way to work it out? If you are told there are no excess reserves and you have some reserves figure, say you have your actual reserves are 44 and you have no excess reserves and your deposits are 220, in other words, using the values from this example. If your deposits were 220 and you were told actual reserves were 44, okay, and you were told there were no excess reserves, and they asked what is the required reserve ratio, it would then be 44 divided by 220, reserves divided by deposits, equals required reserve ratio. But you would normally be given the required reserve ratio. Well, I suppose, yeah, okay. There are a number of ways in which we might ask you to calculate it. Another way would be, knowing, if you know what the money multiplier is, right, another equation, then you know that the required reserve ratio is just the inverse of the money multiplier. So that's another way you could work it out. Okay. So then let's begin with question 18. So there is Fati Bank, and it has just received a deposit of 10,000 Rand. The required reserve ratio is 20%. Based on this information, which of the following statements is or are correct? So you take 2 minutes quickly, look at those statements, and you decide which of them are correct. You can chat with your mates as well. Okay. Number one, Fati Bank must keep 2,000 of the deposits as reserve. Would that be correct? Happy with that? Okay. Number 2, I think, is not actually in this particular version of this textbook, but the idea would be when you make a loan, you expand the money supply. When a loan is repaid, it contracts the money supply. So number 2 would be correct, but as I say, I think it's not actually detailed in this particular version of this text. I could be wrong with that, but I'm pretty sure it's not. So I don't think you're going to, well, you won't get a question this time around, as far as I know, that would say something along the lines of, you know, option 2 there, does the money supply contract when the loan is repaid? I'm pretty sure you won't get that, because I'm pretty sure it's not in this version of the text, unless I'm wrong about that. And then number 3, the banking system can create an additional 8,000 in money supply, the entire banking system. Is that correct? No. 8,000 would be the initial value of the amount that could be loaned out. In other words, the excess reserve amount is 8,000. So the total amount of money that would be created would be 8,000 times the money multiplier. Right? Okay, so options 1 and 2 would be correct in this instance. But as I say, don't worry too much about number 2 if it's not in this textbook, which I'm pretty sure it's not. Which reminds me, for the test, the written test, so test 1.5, the written component is chapters 21, 22, 23. There is one small question on chapter 24, and then chapter 25 as well. So there's no chapter 27, and chapter 20, there is a chapter 24 question. Okay, it's out of 25 marks. The chapter 24 question is 3 marks, and then it's, you know, roughly 5 marks, I guess, from, or a little bit, whatever, 6 marks from each other question, each other chapter, basically 5 or 6 marks. But the chapters are combined. In other words, you know, you might get a question that combines chapter 21 and chapter 22. You know. Okay. Any questions at this point? Anything you want to ask about this particular question? No? Okay. So moving on then to the demand for money. We're going to be looking at a money market. When we have our money market is going to look like every other kind of market that we've dealt with before. We're going to have the price of money. The price of money is the interest rate, right? And we're going to have the quantity of money. And what we're going to see is that essentially we have a downward sloping demand for money. And then depending on how you want to, or how complicated you want to get, you can either have a perfectly vertical supply of money curve, or you can have an upward sloping supply of money curve, so 1 or 2. So that's what our money market is going to look like, just like every other market we've dealt with before. And first, what we have spoken about so far is a little bit about the supply of money. We've seen where money comes from. It comes from either the Reserve Bank or the banking system. The Reserve Bank controls cash directly, cash meaning notes and coins, and deposits are controlled by the banking system, although the central bank has some influence on how much, on how many deposits are within the economy. In other words, they can control the quantity of deposits. Again, we haven't really spoken too much about whether it's vertical or upward sloping, and we will talk more about that, but for now we're going to talk about the demand for money curve, which is going to be downward sloping. So, the demand for money then is a relationship. It's the quantity of money that is demanded, okay, at any given interest rate. Okay, demand for money, the quantity of money demanded. Then it says here that people plan to hold on any given day, okay, whatever. Why do they plan to hold it like that? It's given some interest rate, right? Given some interest rate. So what influences how much quantity people will be demanding? Price level, the interest rate, real GDP, and essentially financial innovation. We'll get to that. Okay, but we want to distinguish between two different types of factors. In other words, the price level, the real GDP, and the financial innovation are all things that will shift money demand. Okay, in other words, shift the entire money demand curve. So real GDP will shift and financial innovation will shift. But the nominal interest rate is actually a movement along the curve. In other words, the nominal interest rate is part of the actual relationship. It's the quantity of money given some interest rate. So if you have some interest rate I and we've got the quantity of money Q, then the demand for money is inversely related to the interest rate. So a change in the interest rate is not a shift, but a movement along. Okay? Change in the nominal interest rate is a movement along the money demand curve. In other words, the higher the opportunity cost of holding money, and we measure the opportunity cost by the interest rate. In other words, the higher the cost of holding money, in other words, the higher the price of money, the smaller the quantity of real money demanded. Okay? So the higher the price of money is another way of saying that is the higher the cost, which means the higher the opportunity cost. Why is it an opportunity cost? Because when we hold money, we are holding something that does not pay an interest rate. What could we be doing with our money? We could be using our money to, for example, buy a bond. If we purchased a bond does pay an interest rate, right? So of all the different types of financial instruments we could be holding, if we choose to hold money, what we are choosing is a financial instrument that does not pay an interest rate, in which case, the higher the interest rate, which is paid on any other kind of financial instrument, the higher the cost to actually holding money. So the higher the interest rate, the less money we actually want to hold, the less the quantity of money demanded. So that's our basic inverse relationship. What affects that relationship, however, is things like the price level. Why do we hold money? In order to make purchases, primarily. So there are two reasons, in fact, that we hold money. This is what Yanni described. And I didn't see a discussion of it in this particular textbook, but there would be two reasons for holding money. There's a transactions demand for holding money, as well as an asset demand for holding money. Transactions demand does not depend on the interest rate, but an asset demand for money would depend on the interest rate. Transactions demand, therefore, is you hold money in order to purchase stuff. So if the price level changes, then the amount of money that you need to hold in order to purchase stuff is going to change. If the price level rises, then people will hold more money than they did before. Okay? In other words, if the cost of purchasing things goes up, we need to hold more money in order to purchase those things. What about real GDP? In other words, the quantity of money that households plan to hold depends on the amount that they are planning to spend. Okay? As real GDP goes up, if real GDP is going up, it means we are spending more. Right? In other words, as real GDP goes up, output goes up. Is the door stuck? Oh. All right, okay. Cool. So back to real GDP then. Do you think they want to come in? If we think so, let me just redraw that again. if we think about our aggregate demand relationship, price, quantity, okay? Some level of output. If we shift our aggregate demand curve to the right, this is GDP. If GDP increases, right, because aggregate demand increases, in other words, we plan to spend more, okay, then the amount of money we need to hold will be greater because we are spending more, okay? In other words, at point A, okay, the amount of expenditure, so that's right, expenditure at point A is equal to P0 times Y0, okay? If for some reason the price level increases, then at point B, expenditure at point B will be P1 times Y0, and of course P1 times Y0 is greater than P0 times Y0. So at point B we need more money to finance that purchase. Alternatively, if we have, say, point C, then expenditure at point C will be P0 times Y1, and P0 times Y1 is also greater than P0 times Y0, right? So expenditure at point C, P0 times Y0. Therefore, at point C, we need more money than we would need at point A. So whether the output, whether GDP increases or price increases, either way we would need more money to finance our expenditure. Okay, so if price level increases, that's going to mean that at any given interest rate we need more money. The quantity of money that we demand increases. If real GDP increases, once again, increase in the quantity of money demanded. There's also this idea of financial innovation. So what does that mean? If you think about, for example, a debit card, right? A debit card means you can carry less cash on yourself, right? So instead of holding your money supply in cash, you can hold it as a deposit. Holding it as a deposit is now different to holding it as cash in your wallet. Okay, that's great. But what about innovations within the banking system that just generally make it easier for you to get cash on demand? So for example, you could hold like a credit card, right? A credit card allows you to get easy access to a loan, right? If you have easy access to a loan, you don't need to hold cash now. You can just enter into a loan when you need cash, right? So then instead of holding cash, you can put your cash into some bond, into some other financial instrument that generates an interest rate, and then when you need cash, you use your credit card for a small payment instead of having to liquidate your bond asset, right? You just enter into a loan agreement and pay that off quickly, and you never have to incur any costs for holding bonds. Alternatively, every time you purchase any kind of financial asset, there is a cost involved. In other words, there's some kind of administrative burden that's involved in you actually purchasing any kind of bond certificate. The lower that cash cost, the lower that cost of holding a bond, the easier or the more inclined you are to hold a bond, and then when you need cash, sell that bond, and then use the cash for whatever purchases you want. So any kind of innovation, and the examples I give here, they just say technological change, right? Any kind of technological change that makes you less inclined to actually want to hold money now is going to influence the quantity of money that you are prepared to hold at any given interest rate. So for the example they give here is a daily interest check deposit. A check deposit is basically like what we would understand as a credit card. I mean, we don't really use check deposits these days, but a credit card is basically like what a check deposit would have been. Or automatic transfers between check and saving deposits, or ATMs, credit cards, debit cards, internet banking, etc., etc. Anything that just says that lowers the amount of cash, or that lowers the amount of money we want to hold on us on any given day, is going to shift, or at any given time period, is going to shift the money demand curve. So the demand for money is the relationship between the quantity of real money demanded and the nominal interest rate. I'm not 100% sure why this textbook refers to the nominal interest rate. They certainly don't put it in the diagram as the nominal interest rate. I find it a little bit confusing to think of this diagram in terms of a nominal interest rate. And in previous versions, they certainly haven't emphasized that it's a nominal interest rate. So I'm not sure why they chose to emphasize the fact that it's a nominal interest rate. In my mind, I think it's a little bit confusing. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just, it's the demand for money and the interest rate, whether it's the nominal or the real. As I say, I don't think it actually makes it very clear why this should be the nominal interest rate, especially given that we're dealing with real money demand and not nominal money demand. So when we have a shift in the demand for money curve, a change in the real GDP or any financial innovation or change in prices shifts the demand for money, the entire curve, right? Shifts the entire demand for money curve. Okay. Yes?
So I just want to know, how would
The velocity. How would technical innovation shift the velocity of money? Is that what you're asking?
does it mean that because there's less money flow basically in the economy,
Mm-hmm.
would decrease the velocity?
Okay, so you're referring to something at the end of the chapter which we haven't got to yet. So at the last slide, we're going to look at that quantity theory of money, which deals with velocity, and then I will answer that question for you. If you will just bank that for a moment, I'll come back to that. Otherwise, I need to introduce that equation now, and it's a little bit out of kilt, right? Okay. So demand for money. I'm not sure why we have the supply of money under the heading demand for money. But anyway, supply of money, the quantity of money that can be created by the banking system depends on the money base and the money multiplier. And we can either think of the money supply as an upward sloping relationship, whereby the interest rate determines the quantity of money supplied, or alternatively, the way we usually think about money supply is just thinking about money supply as being independent of the interest rate. A vertical money supply like this, the assumption is that really it's just the central bank, right? In other words, when the money supply is entirely controlled by the central bank. So entirely controlled by the central bank. Okay? When we have an upward sloping money supply curve, then the kind of assumption is that in fact the money supply is not entirely controlled by the central bank, and it's a function of both the central bank and commercial banking system. Okay? So we normally think of the money supply curve as being upward sloping if we're talking about money supply being a function of both what the central bank controls, in other words, the notes and the coins, and the deposits of the banking system, in which case we have an upward sloping money supply curve. When we simplify things and just assume that the money supply is entirely controlled by the central bank, then we just have an upward vertical money supply curve. Either way, there's very little difference to how the model is going to operate. Anything that shifts the vertical money supply curve to the right is also going to shift the upward sloping money supply curve to the right. Okay? There's very little change in the dynamics between this vertical money supply and an upward sloping money supply curve. But you will often come across a vertical money supply curve, and that as I say, the underlying assumption then is just that the money supply is entirely controlled by the central bank, which it's not in reality. Okay, so what is the supply of money? It's the quantity of money that can be created by the banking system. Upward sloping means the banking system is the central bank and banks. If it's vertical, then the banking system is usually just limited to the central bank. Once we combine our money supply curve and our money demand curve, we have our money market. Okay? What shifts the money supply curve? Again, because the way we are usually focused on money supply is in terms of the central bank, what's going to shift the money supply curve is usually actions of the central bank. Okay? In other words, when the central bank decides money supply should be changed, that's what shifts the money supply curve. Okay? We will talk more about monetary policy in a later chapter, and when we talk more about monetary policy, then we will see in greater detail how the money supply curve shifts. However, because we're talking about real money supply, in the same way that the price level shifts money demand, real money demand, we'll see that the price level also shifts real money supply. An increase in the price level shifts the money supply to the left. So this is, in other words, if prices increase, real money supply decreases. So there are the factors that shift money demand. There are some factors that shift money demand, like price level, that will also shift money supply. But again, once we talk more about monetary policy, we will discuss a lot more what shifts the money supply curve. Where the money demand and money supply curve meet, we have money market equilibrium. And that occurs where the quantity of money demanded equals the quantity of money supplied. Okay, so that's our equilibrium. Again, if our money supply curve was vertical, we would just have, once again, some equilibrium point where money supply and money demand intersect. So no change to that aspect of the market. The effect of monetary policy: with a surplus of money holding, people enter the loanable funds market, buy bonds, and attempt to get rid of extra money they are holding, and this raises the price of bonds and lowers the interest rate. What on earth could that possibly mean? Is the way I think about it when I see something like that. And I don't think that again, it's dealing with chapter 24 stuff, and I don't think it makes a good connection, this textbook, between chapter 24 and chapter 25, or later when we do monetary policy, I think it's chapter 30. It just doesn't really make a good connection between what is being discussed here. So what I'd like to do quickly is just draw that, and you can see what we mean. So if we have a money market, and I'm just going to have a vertical money supply curve with a downward sloping money demand curve, as you would expect to see, and we've got the interest rate. Let's say that the money supply curve were to shift. Okay? So our money supply increases. How would the money supply increase? Well, for example, we've seen that the Reserve Bank can do something called an open market operation. In the open market operation, the Reserve Bank could purchase bonds. When it purchases bonds, it injects money into the money system, right? That injection of money increases money supply. So we have spoken about how the Reserve Bank can shift money supply. Again, we will show this diagram in much more detail when we actually when we discuss monetary policy in the monetary policy chapter, which is chapter 30. But for now, previously in chapter 25, we've discussed that the central bank can increase the money supply by using any of its monetary policy tools. So let's say the Reserve Bank increases the money supply, shifts from MS0 to MS1. Our initial equilibrium was given point A, okay? And the quantity of the equilibrium quantity of money, or rather than that, let's call it M, 0. Okay? Now what's happened is the central bank has increased the money supply. Are you happy that if we compare point B to point A, right? When we compare those two points, the quantity of money supplied, so quantity of money supplied at point B is greater than the quantity of money demanded, given this interest rate I0. In other words, at I0, we've got 2 points, point A and point B. We were initially at equilibrium at point A. Now the Reserve Bank has increased the money supply. Given that equilibrium interest rate, given interest rate I0, the quantity of money supplied will be greater than the quantity of money demanded at point A. Okay? There is more money in the system than people want to hold. If there is more money than people want to hold, what do? Well, excess money. What can you do with your money? You can use it to buy other financial instruments. Okay, you don't want to hold essentially your wealth as money. You want to hold other financial instruments. Okay. Remember, we haven't changed price level. We haven't changed the level of output. We're not talking about any kind of financial innovation. So we're not shifting our money demand curve. We're not changing the amount of money we wish to demand at any given interest rate. Okay. So we haven't changed money demand at all. So we've got some interest rate I0. The quantity of money that we would like to hold is M0. However, there's this amount of money in circulation currently, M1. There is more money that essentially we are holding, that we are being forced to hold, than what we would like to hold. How do we end up? So how does this system balance itself out? Well, if there is more money than what we want to hold, what we do is we take that money and essentially we buy other financial instruments. And the other kind of financial instrument that we're primarily interested in is, for example, bonds, right? So we will therefore wish to purchase more bonds. In other words, the bond market is another way of thinking about the loanable funds market. Loanable funds, remember, demand for loanable funds and supply of loanable funds. Supply of loanable funds is people wanting to lend people money. Demand for loanable funds is people wanting to borrow money, right? Supply of loanable funds. If I've got excess money, I'm going to go into the loanable funds market. I'm going to supply more loanable funds, right? I'm going to go in there and start giving people money to borrow, which means I'm going to buy more bonds, right? So when I buy bonds, right, we can think of it as an increase in the supply of loanable funds. With an increase in the supply of loanable funds, what happens to the equilibrium interest rate? The interest rate goes down, correct, right? The interest rate goes down. Remember, as people purchase more bonds, the price of bonds goes up. With the price of bonds going up, the interest rate goes down, right? So you can see the interest rate starts to decrease. As we start shifting more and more money into the bond market, interest rate starts decreasing. And eventually, we get to a new equilibrium interest rate, okay, with a lower interest rate, okay, where bonds, the price of bonds has increased, the interest rate paid on bonds has decreased. With that lower interest rate, we're also prepared to hold more money, and we end up having more money in the bond market. In other words, you can imagine the Reserve Bank increases the money supply, and then there's a little bit of a shift backwards in order for us to get to our equilibrium. So our new equilibrium point at point B, right, is at a lower interest rate, where we end up holding slightly more money because interest rates have gone down. Interest rates have gone down because we've also put a little bit more money into the bond market, right? So you can imagine what's happened is the Reserve Bank has actually increased the entire money supply, right? And the amount of money that we're actually holding in terms of the money market, right? The money supply that's held as cash, in other words, notes and coins, MS1, is just a small portion of the total increase in the money supply, which includes, for example, an increase in deposits. Okay, yeah?
I'm gonna ask a question, but I think it might be a stupid question, but I'm still gonna ask it. Okay, so I want to know if the interest rate is that the interest rate of, like, if I have a short-term account that I put
Yeah.
my money in and then I get paid at a fixed interest rate, like we study in computational mathematics, or
Yes.
is that interest rate the interest rate that I pay, like the fee
Yeah.
that I pay to the bank?
Cool. So let me redo this market with an upward sloping money supply curve and kind of answer that question for you in a sense. So money demand and upward sloping money supply with an interest rate at equilibrium of I0 and some money quantity of money demand at M0, I and QM. Okay, so the Reserve Bank increases the money supply. Okay? But that increase in the money supply also causes banks, it changes the balance sheet of the banks. Okay? The balance sheet of the banks, they have more money in reserve, which they would like to convert to loans. Okay? Given current interest rates. When we get to our new equilibrium interest rate I1 at M1, you can see that we've moved along a money supply curve and along a money demand curve, whereby the amount of money supplied is actually contracted and the amount of money demanded has increased. Okay? That contraction in money supply curve as the interest rate goes down is banks wanting to lend less. Okay? In other words, as interest rates go down, it's less, they are less interested in lending money. As interest rates go down, people are more interested in holding money. Okay? So when you have a vertical money supply curve, you don't see this dynamic here, which is what I had suggested was kind of like the entire money supply curve shifting further than our actual cash money supply curve, because we've got a change in deposits as well. So when you have an interest rate, this equilibrium interest rate, it's equating not only the interest rate that sits on the money demand curve, it's also an interest rate that sits on the money supply curve. In other words, that interest rate is both the interest rate in this example of the demand side and the supply side. So it's like saying there is no interest rate differential between what you would borrow at and what you would lend at.
So just the merging of where you actually be at that point where both the bank is happy and the consumer.
Well, the way that this is structured actually it's more like the bank takes zero interest rate differential. So in other words, the interest rate you get paid on your account, say you have a deposit and you get paid an interest rate of 3%, the bank would be lending at 3% as well. In other words, anything that you borrowed would get charged at 3% too. So it would be the same interest rate.
Okay, and the curve that we've labeled, the one axis is interest rate. Is
Yes.
what is that also, it's the same, it's interchangeable.
Yeah, so this is the interest rate that's both for supply and demand. And where they intersect, we're saying it's the same interest rate. So
It's kind of okay that we got confused.
about what?
It's basically one and the same.
It is, and obviously in the real world, in practice, it's not exactly the same interest rate on both those curves. There's actually a differential. Yeah. So yeah, easily confusable. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to know. So I know it's interest parity.
Yes.
Would that mean in this case, the inflation rate is stationary? So if money supply were to increase, the inflation rate is unaffected.
Yeah, so for now we are dealing with price level fixed at some price level, right? unless there's some kind of discussion about price level changing, then yeah, you wouldn't assume that prices change. Unless we kind of asked you to assume that price levels changed. You know what I'm saying? In other words, when we discuss this market, all we're interested in is what's happening in this market, then ceteris paribus, everything else, don't worry about any other markets, right? If, however, we say, cool, something happens in this market which affects another market, you know, and then how do those two interact? Well, then we're asking you about two different markets. Then ceteris paribus applies to those two markets, right? And if in one of those markets prices change, then we would, you know, then be assuming that prices were not constant, because in one of the markets prices are changing. But if we're just dealing with a particular model or a particular market, then ceteris paribus would apply to anything else that's not in this particular model, right? If we said, for example, however, that, let me just do a slightly different example. You've got aggregate demand and aggregate supply, okay? And we say there's an increase in aggregate demand, and we say, how does that affect interest rates in the money market, right? Well, now we're saying, cool, let's look at two markets side by side and talk about what are the sort of effects that we're going to see, right? And what we would see is an increase in aggregate demand shifts our money demand curve, right? Which would put upward pressure on interest rates, right? Sorry. Upward pressure on interest rates, okay? And an increase in quantity demanded. So this increase in money demand is because AD shifted. So if we went from AD0 to AD1, for example, from AD0 to AD1, right? However, when the price changes from P0 to P1, right, what we also see is an effect, okay? What we see end up happening is our money supply curve shifts to the left, and you get a further increase in interest rates, right? In fact, that's a good, let's just make one thing clear here. When the price level changes, and that shifts money demand, it doesn't shift real money demand. When the price level changes, it shifts nominal money demand, nominal MD, okay? So when we look at a market like this one where we've got real money, if we're dealing with real money demand, then a change in the price level does not shift real money demand. That's why I say, I'm not sure why they emphasize nominal interest rate here when we're dealing with real money, because I'm not sure what nominal interest rate has to do with anything. But when the price level changes, it will shift the nominal money demand curve and will not shift the nominal money supply curve. But when the price level changes, it does not shift the real money demand curve, but it does shift the real money supply curve. So in this diagram here, when the price level changes, you have a shift to the left of real money supply. So let's just emphasize this is real money. We have a shift to the left of the real money supply, but no change in the real money demand curve. So there's two different changes that happen in the money market when you have a shift in aggregate demand, when you've got the real money demand and real money supply. Why is that? Remember the, yeah, okay, we can just use this diagram, but let me draw it again. When we talk about real money demand, okay, so if it's real money demand, then you're looking at P times Y, right? And real money demand means we're not interested in price level. What we're interested in is the real amount of goods that we're purchasing. Real money demand means real output, okay? So if the price level increases, right, that doesn't change the quantity of money demanded for real purchases, okay? In other words, if I'm buying 10 units of something and they cost R1 each, my real money demand is money demand for 10 units of output, okay? So my real money demand is 10. If my price level increases or changes to R2, okay, and I still want to buy 10 units, my real money demand is still 10. Does that make sense? No? Okay. So let's just okay. So remember, nominal money, okay, versus real money. Okay. So this is tied to something like inflation. If I'm purchasing goods and services, output, okay, at some price level, okay, and let's call that, okay, so output, I'm buying 10 units of output, and let's make the price level different. Make the price level, I don't know, okay, R2, okay. The amount of nominal money required would be 20 Rand, right? Now the price level changes and becomes 3 Rand. The nominal money required is now 30 Rand, okay? But if we treat the price level as fixed in terms of some index, right, the real money, right, I would be spending in the first instance would be Y times P fixed at 2, 20. And in the second instance, so if we call this 1 and we call this 2, nominal money, real money in 1 would be 20, and real money in 2 would be still 20, keeping the price level fixed at whatever our index year is, right? In other words, we're not interested in prices changing, okay? When we deal with real things, we're not interested in how the price level changes, right? When we have nominal things, yes, we're interested in the price level changing. When we're dealing with real stuff, we're not interested in the price level changing, okay? So the real value of our money in both instances is 20. The nominal value of our money is changing, but the real value is the same. Are you with me? Okay. When it comes to money supply, okay, so this is, here we're focusing on the demand side of our money. In other words, demand, which is to say spending. Okay? So here our nominal money demanded, so our nominal money demanded would change if the price level changed. Are you happy with that? If the price level was changing, initially the nominal value of money I wanted was 20. When the price level increases, the nominal value of money I now demand is 30. Are you happy with that? Right? But in both instances, the real value of money I demand remains the same because the value of Y that I'm purchasing is always 10. 10, 10, 10, 10. Right? So the real value of the money that I'm demanding remains unchanged. It's always 10. Okay? Demanded. If, however, I'm looking at the supply side of things, in the first instance, if I have 1 rand, okay, and the price of something is 2 rand, okay, so in example 1 rand is worth half of a unit of Y. Are you happy with that? The price of something is 2 rand, therefore 1 rand is worth half a unit of Y. Yeah? In instance 2, 1 rand is worth a third of a unit of Y. Are you happy with that? Which means the real value of 1 rand, okay, okay, the real value of a unit of money has decreased. Are you happy with that? It's the same as saying the nominal amount of money that I need is more when the price goes up. Why? Because the real amount of goods that a particular unit of money can buy, right, the real value has decreased. Okay? You happy with that? So whilst the real value of money that I want remains the same, the real purchasing power of money changes when the price level changes. Are you happy with that idea? Do you understand the difference between those two statements? Or are you just thoroughly uninterested because I'm getting kind of mixed signals? Okay, you get what's going on? Yeah? Cool. Okay. So, if the nominal value of money is changing, then the real value of a unit of money is changing. But just because the price level is changing doesn't mean that the real value of money that I want is changing. Right? That I want to spend is changing. So if I'm now going to plot my real money demand at any given interest rate, right, against my real money supply, and the price level is P0 and P0 against QM, okay? If the price level now increases, so if the price level goes from P0 to goes to P1, and P1 is greater than P0, okay? So you've got increase in price level. What is going to happen to the value of the money that is currently in circulation? The value of the money that is currently in circulation, right? In other words, for every unit of money in circulation, it's now going to be worth less. And this should be a 3, sorry. Okay, so that should be 1 over 3, sorry. The real value of every unit of money is decreasing as the price level goes up, which means the real money supply is decreasing as the price level increases, right? But the real quantity of money that I'm demanding at any given price level is not changing just because the price level changes. I still want to buy the same amount of goods, right? The real value of money that I want is not changing. If the price level increases, what happens? The real money supply decreases, which raises the interest rate. Oops. The rise in the interest rate leads to a movement along the money demand curve, and I end up holding, sorry, not MD, I end up holding less money in the new equilibrium because of the higher interest rates, right? So my money demand the quantity of real money demanded decreases because the interest rate is changing. In other words, the price level is not shifting the money demand curve. The change in price level is causing a change in interest rate. That change in interest rate is causing a movement along the money demand curve. And so I end up holding less money, less real money, because of the change in interest rate that the change in price level causes. Okay? So the change in price level shifts real money supply, not real money demand. Causes a movement along real money demand. If this was a real, this is real, right? If this was a nominal money market, which we don't have a diagram for, but we can nevertheless, okay, so if this was nominal, okay, then we had some money supply and some money demand, okay? What happens when the price level increases, the quantity of money demanded, the nominal quantity of money demanded changes, right? But we're not changing the money supply. So if we're dealing with a nominal money market, then we have an increase in nominal money demand, MD0 to MD1. Again, we have an increase in interest rates, okay? But now, the quantity, whatever. My money demand has shifted, but I'm not changing my money supply. So I can't shift to that point. I have to move backwards, and my money, nominal money supply and nominal money demand remains constant, and interest rates have gone up. If nominal money supply and nominal money demand remain constant, even though price level has increased, then that's the same as saying that the real money supply and real money demand, quantity of real money demanded, have decreased. Okay, so this was MD at P0, this is MD at P1, and this is MS at P0 or P1. Okay? So money here, let's call it in fact M0. M0 has not changed. M0 has changed. Okay? This is the real money market. The real value of money has decreased because prices have increased. The nominal value of money has not changed due to a change in prices. Okay? Nominal value remains the same. Real value decreases. Okay? That was a bit of a sidebar though, and that's really, we've been going for a long time without a break. We've basically got one more slide though. Should we just like power on for 5 minutes and then just leave early? You happy to do that? Well, let me know, come and ask more if it's still not answered. 5 more minutes and then we go. Happy with that? Okay, so basically we had this statement here which said, with a surplus of money holding, people enter the loanable funds market and buy bonds in an attempt to get rid of extra money they are holding, and this raises the price of bonds and lowers the interest rate. What does this mean? That little star, what I was showing you here was where was it? Oh, it was in this diagram here, right? Saying in the money market, if we look at the money market, what's happening in the money market? I didn't draw the loanable funds market, but maybe what I can do next time is also just draw the loanable funds market. Okay? I don't know, sometime when we talk about what's going on here. Okay, in other words, you want to talk about the loanable funds market? Yeah, well, you don't need to know what this looks like in the loanable funds market. Okay? So what I'm showing you is this in the money market. So this description of what was here is a description of what's happening in the money market. I described what was happening in the loanable funds market. I could illustrate it as well. You don't need to know what it looks like as an illustration. If you want to at any point though, we can. But otherwise, whatever, in this video you can just go back and, I don't know, listen to what I was saying again, and hopefully it makes it clear. If not, yeah, chat to me again. Okay. Then there's this little statement, what happens in the long run when the inflation rate equals the expected inflation rate and the real GDP equals potential GDP. The money market, the loanable funds market, the goods market, and the labor market are all in long run equilibrium, and the economy is in a long run equilibrium. That is a really, really complicated statement. Complicated. And what I would suggest we do is we come back to this statement basically next semester when we begin our next chapter. Okay? So I think it's chapter 28 is our next one, I think. And if I recall, chapter 28 is the ASAD market. Yeah, aggregate demand, aggregate supply is chapter 28. So this is a good basically way in which we can link all of these different diagrams together. So we've got the labor market, ASAD, money markets. We can throw the loanable funds market in if we want to. We can link them all together at the beginning of our ASAD discussion, and we'll use that to then talk more about our ASAD model. So we'll come back to this statement here when we begin ASAD. Okay? So it'll start us at a point of equilibrium, and then we'll see what happens when we shift away from equilibrium. So then the final point was just the quantity theory of money. What is the quantity theory of money? It's basically just an equation which says that MV equals PY. In other words, the nominal value of output must always be equal to the amount of money that is available in the economy times the number of times in which each unit of money gets used. So in other words, if the price level is 3 and the amount of output is 10, so that the nominal value of output is 30, if we have, for example, 5 units of money in the economy, then each one of those units of money must be used 6 times so that the amount of transactions that happen in the economy equals 30 as a nominal value. Okay? So if there are 5 units of money used 6 times, it will produce a transactions value of 30, which is then matches the nominal value of all the transactions. You had asked what happens when M changes or something, what happens to V or something? Oh, it was technology. If it was a technological change that changed M or V. What? Yeah. Or I think you said if there's a technological change, can it change V?
Basically what I was asking is
Yeah.
I was asking if the gross money is effective because I'm not
But
sure whether
yeah.
the money takes into consideration only the currency, so like cash amount.
Yeah.
It takes into account.
No, absolutely. Technology does influence velocity, definitely. In fact, that's one of that's where it has the most impact is in velocity. So what will happen generally then over time is you'll see something like this. If this is in period 1, okay, so this is period 1, we've got a nominal value of output of 30. Now our economy grows in period 2. Let's say that our price level increases to 4, we've had some inflation, but our output has increased to say 20, so that our nominal value of output now is 80, right? Are you happy with that? what you will tend to see then is that in that same period, what will have happened is there will have been some technological change that allows velocity to increase. Let's say our velocity increases to 8, right? And our money supply then increases to 10. So whilst our price and our nominal value of output has increased to 80, that is matched by both an increase in the available amounts of money, and you'll find that there'll be a change in velocity. That's how it tends to happen in reality. No, I'm just saying that what happens over time is all these different things change together, right? No, velocity is not dependent on these things, right? But what we usually do when we look at this equation is we usually assume that velocity is fairly constant. I put it at the bottom, but normally so the normal assumption is that v is constant, right? If you assume that v is constant, okay, then we don't need to worry about v in this equation, really. Okay? Let me do it like this. Hang on. Okay, so if v is constant, so we're saying v is not going to change, then we don't worry about v in this equation. Then we've got m equals py, okay? Then if we rearrange this equation, so m equals py, then m over p equals y, okay? What this is saying is that any increase in money by the Reserve Bank is basically just going to be matched by an increase in price level. It doesn't affect real output. Any increase in M over here increases prices. It doesn't affect output. So an increase in M is matched by an increase in P so that the real value of money remains constant. That's kind of where the quantity theory of money goes ultimately, is it says that price level is determined by money supply. That's what the quantity theory of money is about, really. Any change in money leads to changes in prices and has very little effect on output. And that's a summary of this slide, really. That's the quantity theory of money. Yeah?
He mentioned something that I want to ask and clarify. Does the velocity of money equal, is that the money that we can feel that circulates, or does it mean all money? Like even
Yeah, all money.
even
But
non-tangible?
yeah, like deposits, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be all money. As in anything that is the money supply. Yeah. So, for example, if you have a deposit value, so that's an intangible form of money, right? It's just a little electronic number. So you've got a deposit. You want to buy something from me, okay? And I want to buy something from Paige, okay? Now, let's say you want to buy something from me today, and I want to buy something today as well. But I have to wait for a day for your deposit to come through to me. That means I can't then buy today. I have to wait until tomorrow. But if there's a change in the technology that allows you to pay me with a deposit today, and then I can use that deposit today again, you can see we've speeded up the velocity of money in that day. Whereas the velocity of money in the first instance was you could only use it in that one transaction in a day. Now you can use it in 2 transactions. So we've speeded up the velocity of money through some kind of technological change. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It affects the speed at which it can be, used. Well, it doesn't affect the speed necessarily. It just affects, it's the number of times it can be used in a specific period. And obviously the speed of transfer affects the number of times it can be used. So if I've got money in my wallet today and I want to buy something from someone in Rustenburg, I can't use that money in my wallet easily to purchase, I'd have to drive all the way there, give the guy the cash, and then drive back. Whereas if I have just an EFT, I just EFT to him, and within a couple of hours it's done, or not even a couple of hours, within a couple of minutes, whatever. And then that's much quicker than me trying to drive out there to give him the cash. So that's even a deposit increases the velocity of money generally as well. Yeah, cool. Sorry, okay, that was longer than 5 minutes, but yeah, 7 minutes. Cool. That really finishes. That's everything that chapter 25 covers. As I say, the big issue is just they make this one statement here, which is really a lot of stuff in one little sentence. Okay, and I'd like to use that statement there to begin our discussion on the ASAD, which we will do not next week because it's the break, but the week after that.